Our speaker will speak for a half an hour, and then we'll have questions. And would you please stay muted and put your questions in the chat for Dan Graff. I'd like to introduce him. Dan Graff is a U.S. labor historian at the University of Notre Dame, where he directs the Higgins Labor Program and leads the Just Wage Initiative. It's an ongoing interdisciplinary research and advocacy exploration of the foundational question, what makes any given wage just or unjust? I'm not going to say any more about it because I'm going to leave that to Dan. And here he is, Dan Graff. And thank you for being with us, Dan.
All right, thank you, Melanie. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Okay, great. Well, I want to thank the League, in particular Melanie and Pam and Kathy for organizing this. I'll try to do a, I don't know, roughly 30-minute presentation, and then we can have about the same time for discussion. I will tell you, the Just Wage initiative that I'm about to introduce is really a work in progress by design. Just like I will argue a just wage in and of itself can never be set in some sort of stone, but is always contingent upon multiple factors. We're always interested in good feedback. So questions that you have, good, hard, critical questions about what I'm presenting are certainly welcome. So I just wanted to let you know that, and I appreciate that. And I think, Melanie can correct me, but I think if you have questions along the way during the presentation, you can put them in the chat, and then Melanie will field them to me after the presentation. Is that right, Melanie? Is that how we'll do this? Great. Okay. Right. All right. Yeah. So as Melanie said, I direct the Higgins Labor Program, which is named after Monsignor George Higgins, a prominent U.S. Catholic priest and labor economist in the 20th century. He was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Clinton, and he was just one of the premier members of the Catholic clergy during the 20th century that wrote on social justice issues and helped develop the Catholic Church's position on those. And he was in particular very interested in workers and their interests. So my program within our broader Center for Social Concerns is named not for a benefactor, but for a priest, Monsignor George Higgins. I encourage you to check him out if you're interested. The Center for Social Concerns, where the Higgins Labor Program is part of or is housed, is the place on campus, maybe you've interacted with it, but it's the place on campus where Catholic social teaching, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, is engaged directly, either through research initiatives, through teaching, through community engagement. But it's the place where the church's social tradition is enacted within the university. So we have a lot of community partnerships near and far. We have seminars that involve immersions where students go to places over break to help enliven their study and introduce them to issues and partners. We have a summer service learning program where students are fully funded to go do perform internships all over the country and the world. So those are just some of the things that we do at the center. I encourage you to check out our website. I've got it up here. The Higgins Labor Program in particular focuses on labor questions, past, present, and future. And the Just Wage Initiative is our main component of that. So a few years ago, a group of colleagues and mine at the university, an interdisciplinary group, theologians, philosophers, social scientists, historians like myself, got together and inside the Center for Social Concerns and started discussing some of our concerns about labor issues, especially in the United States. So there's labor issues elsewhere too, and a lot of this applies. Our focus has largely been on the US because most of us specialize that in our scholarship and teaching. So wanted to see if we could apply Catholic social teaching on some of these pressing yet chronic questions that are a big problem in the US economy from working people's points of view. So I'll run you through a few slides right now that give you a sense of what we see as a problem that needs addressing and that led to our Just Wage initiative. So as you see here on this first slide, wages in the US have largely been flat for the last 40 years or more. If you adjust them for inflation, the average hourly wages in the US have really been flat. We talk a lot in the last few months about rising wages, and I think that's a good thing, especially when people at the low end of the labor market are seeing a wage uptick. But if you historicize this, wages have basically been flat in the United States since the mid-1970s, and you see that illustrated there. So we've seen an erosion of the purchasing power of a typical job in the United States. And what's happened is that the economy has continued to grow and it continued to expand and see productivity gains, as you see in that line there. But at some point in the 1970s, the relationship between productivity gains in the economy and hourly wages became decoupled. So if you look at the early part of that graph there, you'll see in the what we call the New Deal era, basically coming out of World War II into the 1970s, great productivity gains also met with rising wages, and they moved together so that when the economy did well, when business did well, workers also did well. But that got severed in the mid-1970s, and you see productivity has continued at roughly the same pace into the near present, but again, wages stayed flat, right? So much more of the wages or the wealth of the productivity gains in this country have been going to the top sliver of people. You probably hear a lot, increasingly we talk in public about the problems of inequality in the United States and how they're growing, whether we're facing a second Gilded Age. But you see here on this slide, the richest 5% of Americans have seen their fortunes go up, especially over the last 2 decades. If we're talking about the 21st century, the top 1%, you see it even rise further. The bottom 90% in terms of share of wealth in the United States is really plummeting. So that's related to jobs. We can talk about wealth, we can talk about income. Most Americans still get their living from working for somebody else, increasingly multiple jobs for many households. So we're interested in not just thinking about poverty, not just thinking about wealth distribution, but really thinking about the relationship of those things to jobs, and whether the good job, as we Americans define it, has been in decline and disappearing. What has explained the erosion of the employment contract? And so here's another graph showing from 1983 to 2016, 2 moments in time, how the top 0.1% have really gained in household wealth. The top 1%, significant gains. The bottom 40% of households have seen no gains over those 2 time periods. So I think we talk a lot about these facts, but it's still seeing them starkly laid out in these visual forms can really be jarring. We've gotten to the point where on the eve of the pandemic, 3 men in the United States own more than the bottom 50% of Americans. All right, that's what we mean when we talk about increasing inequality and problems of an inequality in terms of wealth and prosperity. Part of the problem here is that institutions that used to play a role in assisting wage growth for working people have also declined in representing workers as well as in advocating for workers. So you see here the rise and fall of organized labor in the United States is that blue line. So if you look at that roughly through the last century, you see that big growth during the Great Depression, and roughly between 25 and 35% of workers being unionized in the United States from the mid-1930s until the 1970s. And you see the rapid decline of the union movement since the 1970s. So, unions, just like corporations and government, are polarizing institutions in US culture, and people have wide opinions on their place, proper or not. But the one thing that unions have done in the United States has been to convert at least some profits into wages. So the era of greatest wide shared prosperity has also been the era of when the labor movement has been strongest. And you see the red line links the share of income going to the top 10%. And you see those are sort of inversely in proportion to each other. So in addition to union decline and Americans not figuring out a way, if there aren't unions, to help Americans get rising wages, share in that prosperity, government has also played less of a role in shaping the wage question. So here you see, basically over the last 80 years or so, the minimum wage. So if you look at the climbing line, that's the unadjusted wage. That's just actually what the dollar figure is at any given time. In the US, unlike a lot of places, the minimum wage is not indexed to inflation. So it requires an act of Congress to pass. So when you see a flat line, that's eras when there's a minimum wage hike and then it stays at that for a period of time. We're currently in the longest period of time without the federal minimum wage being raised since the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938, which actually created the federal minimum wage. The more telling feature is the red one, because that adjusts the minimum wage for inflation and reveals purchasing power. So you see the peak purchasing power is right around 1970 for the minimum wage, and it's been in rough decline ever since. So we can debate what the minimum wage is for. Should it be a living wage? Should it help someone to escape poverty? But certainly in the same period of peak unionization is when the minimum wage was worth the most. So as the union movement has declined, so has state activism on behalf of workers, whether they're in unions or not. So the two major institutions, the labor movement and the federal government, have really not played an active role in shaping wages, and which is why since the 1970s, they've largely been flat. This is not just a story of class. I've just sort of done it in overall numbers, but a couple of graphs will reveal here. But there's a racial story and a gender story to this as well. And we can unpack more of this if you like. But here's those same 2 years that I showed you earlier, 1983 and 2016. But here it breaks out median wealth by race. And that's pretty stark as well, the difference between white households, Black households, and Latino households. So race and class in the United States have always correlated very closely. And it's just a reminder that when wages are flat for the median worker, that's really impacting Black and brown communities in particular, who are in the lower ends of the labor market. If you turn it to the gender question, we can illustrate it in this way. We talk about a wage gap or the gender pay gap. And you see here, the blue line is men's wages, the reddish line are women's, and this is the median hourly wage for men and women. You do see in the wake of the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the feminist movement in the 1970s, a narrowing of that. From the 1970s through the 1990s, part of that story is men's wages were declining, but women's wages were rising and closing that gap. Since the turn of the 20th century, there's really been no closing of that gap, though. So if we want to talk about progress for gender equality, it's not happening in terms of wages. And I can share with you other slides if you're interested that break out that this is the same no matter what a quintile or decile of the labor market you look at, that actually the wage gap exists for women who are working at poverty level wages versus men, as well as CEOs. There's still that gap. So this is a race and gender question too. The pandemic has only heightened and increased what I would call this chronic crisis of flat wages for American workers. You see that wages, to an extent, have gone up in the pandemic, but nowhere near what billionaire wealth has done or corporate profits. So the pandemic actually, despite all the talk of essential workers and a sort of rhetorical rallying around the need to respect those who perform essential duties that make our economy hum and run, whether it's grocery store clerks or bus drivers or custodians, or in particular, obviously, healthcare workers, there hasn't been a closing of the gap in terms of wages. The pandemic has only exacerbated what we've already been seeing before. So it's those sorts of problems and questions that led us to form this Just Wage initiative. And because we're at a Catholic institution, we wanted to see if we could utilize Catholic social teaching, which applies a moral lens to economic questions that in the US so often are devoid of any kind of moral component. When we talk about the economy in the media, and really at the level of politics, it's so often about GDP, inflation rates, unemployment rates. Those matter, but when they abstract them at that level, it can almost become naturalized in the sense that, we lose sight of that there are real human relationships at the heart of our economy, and that humans are the ones who make the decisions on what our economic rules and processes are. So this is just a list of core Catholic social teaching principles that are widely shared by most faith traditions. So this is not about our Just Wage initiative is for Catholics only, or that we're interested only in Catholics. It's just we used this as a way to bring together people from different academic disciplines to talk about these wage problems. And we used Catholic social teaching as a vocabulary that would allow the economist to talk to the historian, to talk to the theologian, to talk to the law prof, because we often in the academy today don't share a language. We're in our own disciplinary silos. So a concern for human dignity, a concern for the common good, a question of solidarity. And the eighth one there is really central to us because we think people really care about work. They like to work. They want to be compensated for doing good work. And so the dignity of work should be central to the way that our economy runs. Jobs should carry and express the dignity that each person is entitled to. So that's how we approached this question. And I'll in the time I have left, I'll just run you through the basics of this framework and tool that we've created, and then try to get some feedback from you. So we started with this foundational question. The term just wage itself comes out of Catholic inquiry all the way back to the medieval era, debating what makes a given wage just or unjust. We liked the language of that in hopes that most people think that they act justly, whether they're an employer, a consumer, a worker, whatever. They see themselves as acting justly and wanting to. And we wanted to invite people in, no matter what their economic position, where they are as a stakeholder, to think about and participate in a conversation on what makes a wage just or not. So we fought over, debated for many months, and then came to something of the conclusion. We developed a just wage framework that consists of what we call 7 interlocking criteria that altogether help contribute to answering the question if a particular wage is just or unjust. So we number these for reference, but I should tell you they're not meant to be ranked. And that's why they're in this, what I call this honeycomb of hexagons. You could envision them moving around. There's no sort of magic to where they're placed here. It's meant to show interconnections, not any kind of ranking. So you see the list there. The first is that a wage should enable a decent life for the worker in the worker's household. A second, a wage should enable asset building, so somebody can look to the future and not just survive today. Third is a wage should provide some sort of social security. That's an American term, of course, that speaks to our system of unemployment compensation and old age pensions. But there should be some role for government in assuring floors and assuring that people through accidents or through any other problems aren't going to die. So there's got to be some sort of social security to this that we all contribute to. A fourth is that a just wage needs to be totally inclusive and not discriminatory. So you cannot have a just wage or a just wage structure within a system where people are differentially able to access the economy by race, gender, and other ways. Fifth has been the most interesting in terms of feedback and the most controversial, but we argue that a just wage cannot be excessive and that we have too much sort of extremes between the top wage earners and the bottom, whether in organizations or across the country. And so a just wage shouldn't be excessive. Sixth is a just wage should reflect participation by the workers in determining it. Now, the most logical way is usually through unionization, but there's all sorts of different ways that workers' interests can be reflected in the determination of a wage, and participation should matter. People should have a voice in the conditions of their work and be able to contribute that voice. And the seventh is the more traditional in a market economy that a wage should consider performance, qualification, and type of work. There's a recognition in our just wage framework that we're within a capitalist economy, that a surgeon will and maybe should make more money than, I don't know, a history professor, you could argue. But there's a recognition that it's not every wage needs to be the exact same and it's flat. There's all sorts of investments and recognition of importance that can go into whether a wage is just or unjust. So that's the 7 criteria. And this is an online tool that we've created so that multiple stakeholders can go onto our website and take the tool, use the tool. So the point is, it's a very basic tool at this point, but the idea is like an individual person could go in and say, I work at a place and I'm going to use this tool to determine whether the just wage framework, how it sees my wage. It could be an entrepreneur who's starting a business who says, what do I think matters most? And they could answer the tool in terms of how I would want to set up an employment scenario. So the idea is that multiple people could use it for multiple ways, but we have these lists of indicators for each criterion where we ask, the person's either opinion or their assessment of whether something's being met. And you see criterion 1 there, a decent life. You just see 5 indicators where the answers allow you to strongly agree, to strongly disagree, and 2 in between there. So that's the way the tool operates. You do that for each of the criteria. And then we produce a results key where the golder that a particular criterion is, of course, we're at Notre Dame, the more gold it is, the more just it is in our understanding. And if they're lighter colored criteria, you'll be recommended to visit some resources on these and think about why those are less realized in your scenario. So each of our criteria has 4 different resource essays with links to all sorts of other resources. Because again, we're at a Catholic institution, we start with what does Catholic social teaching say, but we do have a vision that in the future we might say, what do faith traditions say more generally, and integrate other traditions. The second resource, what is the law? And again, right now it's US law, but we could envision it broadening beyond that. Third is what does research show, to give people some access to some cutting edge research. And then who does it well, whether that's a country, whether that's a company or something in between. So we design it as a tool for people to use, and they can measure their own wage scenario against our sense of justness. And then there's resources if they want to learn more about it. And I'll close now. I think I've got about 4 or 5 minutes. I think I'm making good time, but I'll close with why we've designed our just wage framework and tool this way and what we think it offers, because there's lots of other ways that you can talk about wages. And there are some other websites that allow you to do something similar to what we're doing. The first point, I've already made this, but I want to reiterate it, is that we don't see any of the criteria as more important than the other. We think that a wage can only be understood in terms of these interconnected criteria, and that you cannot say, non-discrimination is only 7th out of the 7. That seems highly foundational to me, that a just wage shouldn't accommodate discrimination of any kind. But the point for us is we want people to see the links connecting different criteria. Too often when we have discussions about whether someone's a good employer or not, we say, well, they pay well, or they have a really good affirmative action program, or they have wonderful benefits. Well, what if we tried to situate the conversation holistically and see all these things as connected to one another rather than separating them out? Our goal in not ranking is rooted in that, although we debated and we had lots of people who have opinions on what's more important and less important. The second point is, it's related to this first, but the just wage framework is holistic and it's qualitative. So we did not do a quantitative tool that would end up producing, this is the dollar amount per hour, or this is the points that will get you to a just wage. Again, the goal is to invite stakeholders in this very polarized economic and political climate to discern and discuss these issues, not turn them off immediately. We don't want an employer going in and seeing, oh, you have to pay $20 an hour to be considered just in this scenario. I'm out. I can't afford that. I'm not even going to talk about this. The same with points. So the idea is that we want to start discussion and help stakeholders come to possibly some different conclusions or reach some different ideas from where they start. But it's not our job to rank or to decide a point total. I'm all in favor of the Raise the Wage Act debated in Congress that would make $15 an hour a new minimum wage. This is not an argument against those kinds of arguments. It's just we want to do something different that's less about deciding what the right answer is and more encouraging stakeholders to participate in making that decision. And that leads to the third point, where we see a just wage, as we envision it, as more robust. Again, you can't reduce it to one thing. It's so much in American economic discourse, we talk about what does a job pay? And that's at the extent. If you read the newspaper and it says, hey, the city is trying to recruit this employer to come to town, there will be this many jobs and these are the amount that the jobs will pay. Even if you get that, usually it's just here's the number of jobs that we'll provide. So telling us what the wages will be is important, but it's not the only thing. And too often we just have these narrow understandings. The fourth point I've mentioned, that it really for now is rooted in a US or an American context because all the people participating specialize in it. And it would be really, really challenging to design a website that's going to include all sorts of information the world over. However, it's really important to compare the US to other countries to learn, why does Germany have a stronger union movement despite the fact that it's also faced globalization challenges? Or what allows France to provide universal health care that is a problem for the US? Every other country is not always right, and the US is always wrong. But too often Americans think we're exceptional and the American way is the only way. And it really is important to provide the sort of comparative benchmarks. I've already mentioned that fifth point, that we're rooting this in Catholic social tradition, but very interested in all people finding it of use. So we're really thinking about ways that we can make sure it doesn't turn off people who are like, I'm not Catholic, this is not for me. And then again, I've already mentioned that sixth point, that multiple contexts, multiple stakeholders. This is a tool that we want to be used widely rather than a narrow one. And that's, I said at the opening that I really am open to feedback. because the just wage initiative is going to be an ongoing one where we might constantly be modifying the framework and the tool. The way we've designed those hexagons, we could probably modify or add other criteria as we decide. That's the point of that kind of visualization. I guess that's perfectly 30 minutes. I think I started at 12:05. So that just gives you an introduction to what we're doing with this just wage framework, an online tool. And I'm very open to hearing feedback, whether in the form of questions or counters or just anything you'd like to discuss. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dan. That was just fascinating to me. We have several questions and comments. The first one is it okay for us to share these charts on social media? They are important to people, for people to see.
Sure. Yeah. And that's a great question. Yes, I want you to share. I would really like it for you if you can just include that this is out of the Higgins Labor Program at the University of Notre Dame and can point people to the website to learn more. That would be great. But this is nothing. We designed this as an open access, and discussion and spreading the gospel of discussion is important to us. So thanks for that question.
Okay. The next question is, who is to, quote, blame for the decline of union membership? Do union busting corporations, the government / public policy, the unions themselves, and the public all share the blame?
How much time do we have? Yeah, that's a complicated question. I mean, like my simple answer, although as a historian, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that I would say it's multi-factor, is that the sort of ways in which the US industrial relations system evolved out of the New Deal and during World War II created this very adversarial system that worked from the perspective of workers who were in unions in helping raise wages and extend benefits, pulling some of the prosperous post-war decades economy, converting that into workers' wages and benefits. So it worked in an era of economic growth and prosperity. The reason the 1970s is the hinge when all these graphs that I've shown you suggest this rapid change in what was happening is rooted in the economic crisis of the 70s, the oil crisis, the end of the long post-war boom, the re-rise of Japan and Germany as economic competitors. So there's a historical reason for that, but it's US policymakers and employers, sort of large employers, corporations, their response to the economic challenges of the 70s was to capitalize on the relative weakness of the American labor law system. So it was a decision that we're gonna try to break or at least weaken the labor movement, which they successfully did beginning in the 1970s, and it's happened since. There's been no policy changes of any significance since that time period. So, in other words, the way the US labor relations system emerged and evolved was predicated on American workers doing well if they were in unions and if the economy was strong. But there were not a lot of laws and regulations created of a strong social safety net for everyone, whether they were in unions or not. So the unions were the vehicles that were relied upon to take care of this, and they did for 30 years. Then the weakness of that system and the ability of employers to evade it became quite clear in the 70s and 80s in these tougher economic times. So partly it's history, partly it's decision-making by elites, whether they're corporate elites or politicians. We can certainly debate, union miscalculations and these sorts of things, but really the answer is US policymakers and corporate leaders decided that the way to go and maintain profits in a globalizing economy was to go after the union movement. and maintain profits at the expense of wages. And we just haven't, our political system has not accommodated reforms to that. There's a lot in Congress right now that's bottlenecked that would do things, everything from make it unionizing easier, raising the minimum wage, I already mentioned, creating some social policies like paid childcare, paid leave that just make the US an outlier to the rest of the world and put most of economic security questions on the back of individual households. And so we're in a pickle now. And I don't know how to get out of that. You know, it's interesting that Americans polls show the greatest favorability on like unions in 50 years, and young people are way more positive about unions and way more critical of the way the economy is operating. So I think we're going to see some changes, but thanks for the question. I'm sorry about the very long answer. Well, Melanie, you're muted.
Now I've got to get back to the chat. Let's see. Why do you think that even Americans who are struggling economically buy into the narrative that rich CEOs deserve the lion's share of the profits a company creates because they earned it and they took risks for it?
Yeah.
Don't such CEOs often get pay bonuses even when workers get laid off and profits fall? Don't the profits rise or fall based on all of the workers in the corporation? Why don't these things seem to matter to Americans who are more likely to be employees than as CEOs?
I agree with you. That's a big problem. But the big problem I see is less the sort of I don't believe there's a total buy-in, you might say, from American workers. I think as labor unions and other workers institutions have declined, their voices of opposition to that kind of status quo are drowned out in the public sphere, and can't get much traction. I do think you're right, though, that there's a strong American strain that dates back to the founding of the country of a belief in property rights, which was a radical thing in the context of breaking free from a monarchical system of inherited nobility and very strict class statuses where you couldn't move from one to the other. The US was very open, even with all sorts of exclusions and constraints, but much more than the European counterparts. And so there became a strong attraction of ordinary free Americans to property rights in an era when land and property was much more widely distributed than it became after industrialization. So that's a strong cultural strain that Americans don't like to, quote, penalize or, quote, punish people for being successful. The problem with that is that criterion 5, that excessiveness question, like how much is too much? And we do live in a world of limits. So, you know, if you don't have caps on income, whether it's through progressive taxation or even setting some sort of regulations on CEO pay, that's going to go to the most powerful and already resourced, and there's not as much to go to everyone else. So it is a political problem and a cultural one. The person is on the right track. You can find anyone shopping at Walmart. You can just go interview some people who will agree with that sentiment, that that's fine. But I think there's a lot more opposition to that is ready to be harnessed if there's a more direct challenge to it in the political realm. But it's a challenge in the American context in particular. I will tell you, when we've presented the just wage framework, I mentioned when I was introducing the different criteria that number 5, the excessiveness one, is the most controversial, because people will make that argument that your questioner is concerned about. They'll say, I want to raise the minimum wage, but do not create a maximum wage. I'm all for floors, but do not put ceilings. And my job, as I see it, is to try to convince people that you cannot disconnect those. The just wage framework is all about keeping things connected and not allowing you to see one part and ignore its relationship to other parts, that's one of the big ones there. So that's my favorite criterion and the one that I'm spending most of my time researching right now. Great
Okay.
question.
The next question. The framework you outline seems to fit with what Pope Francis has said about the dignity of work and workers, but we seldom hear about such issues in American U.S. Catholic churches. Why do you think this is the case? Why is this a hard sell to U.S. Catholics and other Christians?
Again, big question. You know, when I talked about the origin story of the Just Wage Initiative, I spent most of my time talking about the economy and what I call the chronic crisis that is like 4 or 5 decades running for American workers. That was the main motivation for me going into this project. But the main motivation of my colleague, who's a theologian and a social ethicist at Notre Dame, was, what does the church have to say on this? The principles are all show concern about these trends, and yet it doesn't seem to be getting voiced in the Catholic Church, in the parishes, from the pulpits on Sundays, or outside. It seems like Pope Francis is raising this a lot, but the church institutionally is not seeming to do much, especially in the American context. So that was one of the other reasons we've created this, was can we re-energize in the Catholic Church Catholic social teaching when it comes to labor questions. I mean, Catholic social teaching is like strongly supportive of workers forming unions, not just being able to and protected to form them, but saying that this is how workers should express their interest. That's a vehicle that's viable and desirable. And yet, I'll be honest with you, most Catholic employers, whether they're hospitals or universities, let's say, are strongly anti-union and fight it tooth and nail. So there is this disconnect, and I think it's the youth, it's Catholic youth, if the church can hang on to them, who are going to help re-energize that part of Catholic social teaching. But I'm with your reader or your questioner, that I'm struck sometimes by the absence of it. I'm Catholic, so I'm speaking from it that way. Some might not say I'm the best Catholic, but I am Catholic and subscribe to most, if not all, of the tenets. But yeah, the sort of so-called cultural issues seem to have taken over the church's priorities. But my argument would be that these economic ones are also cultural ones, and that we need to connect them. So it's a much longer conversation, and I appreciate the question. We're hoping to contribute to that discussion too.
The next question is, you may have, I don't know, answered this a little bit. It says, in criteria, what would be considered an excessive wage?
Well, we lay out questions in the indicators we provide. Again, this is one of those instances where there's not just a number. We just don't say, here's the answer. It does require conversation. You could even interpret the excessiveness question as, like, should there be limits on what workers ask from employers? It really depends on the enterprise, right? An enterprise that is a nonprofit, that is, has limited resources, a just wage in that context might be very different than a just wage at Amazon. So excessiveness is the answer, I think, needs to be come to the answer through dialogue and through transparency in an organization, say what people are being paid. So I think you look at what's happening in the organization and what are the gradations of pay, and can you come to a number that, like, 200 times the median salary for the executive. If it's above that, it's excessive. Different places have done these sorts of studies and will make those arguments. So we point people to those, but also at the level of taxation, because you can address this in terms of an employer. What are our rules going to be? There are a handful of employers that say the top will only make at the most 30 of the bottom. It's very rare that an employer will do that, but there are those that exist. But largely this is done through government taxation and deciding that those who've benefited the most from the system will have higher tax rates, the more money that they make, that's going to get plowed not into that enterprise necessarily, but through the general revenues that promote the social wage, we might call it, which is the wage that's that's provided through government, whether, public parks are part of the social wage, so are public schools, and so are pension systems and occupational safety and health and these sorts of things. So the answer might frustrate your questioner that I don't say this is excessive. I think it's very context dependent, but it's an important conversation to have.
Okay, there are a couple of comments here. I love the idea of socially responsible CEOs using the criteria to set up their business wage model. What a great tool. And yes, please expand to other faith traditions. I don't think this will be difficult to do. I love that this can be used by multiple people, both workers and employers. I also love the fact that you provide links to explanations and research. Finally, I love that you are trying to reorient the entire conversation to be more holistic. Could you discern and discuss that and bring everybody into the conversation? There are also a couple of other questions after that. So
yeah, I appreciate that comment. That's music to my ears. So I appreciate that. I should warn that the framework itself, even right now, is a work in progress, meaning that we're struggling to flesh out these 4 resource essays for each of the criteria. We're a cash poor unit at Notre Dame, a very rich institution. So I work with some undergraduate research assistants in doing the research, composing the essays, and then putting them online. Another resource we have that the questioner and others might be interested in, we had a Just Wage Forum that was supposed to be in person and was killed by the pandemic in March of 2020, but we went ahead in early 2021 and held it online. And we recorded all the sessions. So we had an intro session where I and some others spoke more generally. But what we set it up as, for each of the individual criteria, we asked one academic or scholar researcher and one practitioner, whether a business owner, a manager, a unionist, an advocate of some kind. We asked one from each realm, because part of our goal is to bring the ivory tower to the community, learn from the community, bring it back. So we wanted to have this sort of 2 different worlds talking to each other, maybe the theoretical and the research oriented versus the practical and the applicable. And so we have these great videos for each of those where you can listen to people give a presentation and then there's a dialogue after it. So those are all up on the website under the Just Wage Forum. I think when we complete the website, which should happen in the next month or so, and we have it all fleshed out, we then will interface 2 of our Just Wage initiative. The goal is to figure out how and where to take that on the road. How do we get into invitations to employers who want to hear us talk about it? And how do we partner with organizations where we can supply some of this resource and reference and framing material and then see what people do with it, right? Because we are in the academy and that's what we do for a living, is not only teach, but also research and study. And we hope that people will use it. So I would ask the person who asked that question or made that comment, where do you see us needing to take this to? Whether it's a mosque or a temple in the community, whether it's reaching out to city or county government, whether it's local employers, or even broader, like, we're open to suggestions and getting connected to people as we envision the next phase. I think one way the website might develop, it's such a simple, blunt framework and tool right now, but we might, without compromising the values and the ideas behind it, create what you might call different entry points where someone can say, I'm an employer and interested in learning more about it. And they'll get the same information, but it just might be presented differently than if it's a worker coming in or a community group. So those are some ways that we might do this. We might also figure out a way. Right now, we don't capture data from people using the tool. So we could decide that this could be useful for research, whether that's designing software of the tool that we take to an organization and they have their employees complete it to see what their employees value, and then we can consult. We're open to all sorts of uses for this. So I hope that answered the last part of that question a bit.
discernment and discussion is critical. How we implement that or encourage that and then maybe capture some of that for some research is open.
I think the questioner wanted us to discuss right now today.
Well, there you go. I mansplained it, sorry.
Yeah, but I also want to get to the questions and make sure that everybody's question gets asked. So I'm going to continue with that, and then if we have, can open it up later, if we have time, let's do that. The next question is, if a company would utilize the just wage framework, do you think they could succeed within the context of the economy we have now?
I think there's serious competitive pressures depending on sectors. So I think yes, but it would be a challenge and limited. And it does require, it's not simple. And the answer is just not like, come on, employer, suck it up, you can do it. I think it's real and legitimate that employers operate within a competitive context that we have to be sensitive to. So it's a qualified yes to that question.
The next one is, thank you for sharing this just wage tool with us. I was wondering how you have been getting it to businesses who care about being socially responsible.
Yeah, the short answer is we haven't done a whole lot of that yet. Most of our work has been researching and designing the tool that has included lots of informal consultations through various networks. So, but it's talking at an informal level rather than taking the complete tool and framework and presenting it. So that is the next phase. But what's been heartening to me is that as we've talked to managers, management side attorneys, and employers, admittedly a limited pool, but it's the people that we know or people that can connect us to people who are interested. We've been heartened by the response, for the most part, by employers has not been, this is insane, you cannot expect me to engage this, it's pie in the sky. It's been, this is raising useful, interesting questions, and I'd love to share with you some of my pressures and concerns about being a good employer. I think there's a lot more employers who are interested in being an authentically good employer than we give credit for, and then we see. And a lot of what gets celebrated in the media are a lot of superficial, what we often call greenwashing and these sorts of things, these sorts of announcements of policies by big corporations. But that's where we're at right now. So suggestions that people have for, hey, you should reach out to this local employer, or I know about some of this stuff and there's a great employer in Portland or Chicago that's engaging in some things. Please share that with me. My email should be on here somewhere. Didn't I put it at the end? Yeah, there it is.
The next question is that led into the next question, which was, have you shared this at events hosted by the Indiana or St. Joseph Regional Chamber of Commerce? This might be an interesting way to reach business owners who can start thinking differently about the companies they are building.
We haven't yet reached out for an ask to present formally or gotten an invitation, but I've had conversations with some staff at the local chamber. The one in particular I've talked to has been receptive to further conversations. So I'll take that piece of advice that maybe it's time to reach out and see. But that's an example for, of a smart local network that we should connect with. So thank you for that. I should also say, I totally encourage you all to keep conversing about this. I do have to leave just after 1 because of an appointment. I got to get to, I'm at campus by 1:30 for a meeting.
One more comment, I think, and then a couple of the questions I think you've already dealt with.
Okay.
The person says, I understand this comes from a faith initiative, but it could come from no particular faith or no faith, just social value system.
Right.
This may keep some folks from participating if it is connected to a particular church or faith. And I had made a comment later on about Faith in Indiana is linking to a lot of different social issues across religions.
Yeah, so I agree. That's one of our tricks is like, how do we not shy away from or disavow the Catholic social teaching context? That's what this is rooted. I think that's maybe that next phase of the website might be a landing page that starts with, some explanation, maybe de-emphasizes at the outset the CST origins to get people in, and then maybe gives people a different faith traditions a way in. So open to ideas. So please have that person reach out to me if they have more specific questions about it. But it is a concern of mine.
Okay, this last comment says, I'm not someone very excited about economics, but in capital letters, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I like
And then-
that as a final comment.
Yeah, many other thanks also.
Well, thanks to everyone who joined in. I really appreciate it. This was enjoyable for me. I really thought the questions were thoughtful too, and they're questions that I often am thinking about. So I know I'm on the right track with some of my own questions when others are raising them. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me, visit the site, but also send me an email. Maybe you are a member of an organization that, look, we have several people working on this. One of us can connect with another event if you want to do one of these. I mean, you see, we can do it in an hour. Doesn't take too much time. So we're happy to spread the word. Thank you so much, Melanie.
Dan,
Okay,
thank
well,
you
once
so
again,
much.
Thank you. This
Thank
was
you. I'll
wonderful.
stop sharing and I will have to go, but I hope you keep talking about it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.